Ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you a question. What is the first image that comes to your mind when you hear the words, a woman living alone? For many people, the answer comes instantly. They imagine loneliness. They imagine struggle. They imagine something missing. But what if everything we've been taught to assume is wrong? What if a woman living alone is not a symbol of absence, but a symbol of choice? Because here's a truth that most people never stop to consider. The strongest decisions are often the ones that look strange to the crowd. A woman who lives alone faces something that few people understand. She must learn how to create her own security. She must make her own decisions. She must become comfortable with silence, independence, and responsibility. And whether you agree with her choices or not, there is something powerful about a person who refuses to build their life around fear. Think about it. Many people stay in relationships because they are afraid of being alone. But it takes a different kind of strength to be alone because you refuse to settle. That strength doesn't come from confidence. It creates confidence. The ability to wake up every morning and know that your happiness, your direction, and your future are your responsibility is one of the most powerful forms of personal freedom that exists. Today, we're going to look beyond the stereotypes. We're going to explore what really happens when a woman builds a life on her own terms, not through assumptions, not through opinions, but through the psychology of independence, self-respect, and personal growth. Because the truth is this, a woman living alone is not necessarily waiting for someone to complete her life. Sometimes she's busy creating a life so meaningful that anyone who enters it must add value to it. And that changes everything. There is something most people misunderstand about highly empathetic individuals. They assume that because these people are patient, understanding, and forgiving, they will always be there. They mistake consistency for permanence. They mistake compassion for weakness. They mistake generosity for an endless supply. And that's where the biggest mistake begins. You see, an empath is often the person who notices what everyone else misses. They're the one who can hear the frustration hidden behind a simple sentence. They're the one who can sense when someone is struggling, even when that person insists everything is fine. They have a natural tendency to absorb emotional information from the people around them. Because of this, they often become the emotional support system for friends, family members, partners, and even complete strangers. People feel safe around them. People feel understood around them. People feel accepted around them. But there is a hidden cost to being that person. When someone is constantly giving emotional energy, constantly listening, constantly understanding, and constantly making space for everyone else's feelings, they are investing something valuable. They're investing time. They're investing attention. They're investing emotional resources that can never be recovered. Yet many people become so accustomed to receiving this support that they stop recognizing its value. What was once appreciated becomes expected. What was once a gift becomes an obligation. And the moment kindness becomes an expectation, the relationship begins to change. Think about how often this happens. Someone calls only when they need advice. Someone reaches out only when they're facing a crisis. Someone expects immediate understanding after making the same mistake over and over again. The empath listens, they help, they encourage, they forgive. Then it happens again, and again, and again. At first, they tell themselves that everyone struggles. They tell themselves that nobody is perfect. They tell themselves that people deserve patience and understanding. And they're right, people do deserve those things. But there is a difference between supporting someone through a difficult season and becoming a permanent emotional resource for someone who never intends to change. Most people never notice the shift because the empath rarely announces it. That's what makes this dynamic so dangerous. The empath is usually not the person who creates dramatic confrontations. They are not the person who demands constant attention. They are not the person who threatens to leave every time they're hurt. Instead, they observe. They pay attention. They collect evidence through behavior. While everyone else is focused on words, the empath is quietly studying patterns. They notice who only appears when they need something. They notice who takes without giving. They notice who apologizes without changing. They notice who expects understanding but never offers it in return, and every observation gets stored away. The fascinating thing is that most people believe relationships end because of major events. They imagine a single betrayal, a huge argument, or a dramatic moment that destroys everything. But often, that's not what causes an empath to leave. What causes them to leave is accumulation. It's the accumulation of disappointments, the accumulation of one-sided effort, the accumulation of feeling valued only for what they provide. Every time their kindness is taken for granted, another piece of trust disappears. Every time their emotional labor goes unnoticed, another layer of connection weakens. Every time they give understanding and receive indifference, the emotional distance grows larger. The person benefiting from this dynamic usually doesn't see any of it happening. Why? Because the empath continues showing up. They continue helping. They continue listening. They continue supporting. On the surface, everything appears normal. But underneath, something important is changing. The emotional bond is slowly eroding. Imagine a bridge losing one bolt at a time. From a distance, the bridge looks exactly the same. People continue driving across it. Everything appears stable. Yet with each missing bolt, the structure becomes weaker. Eventually, there comes a point where the bridge can no longer support the weight placed upon it. Relationships often work the same way. The empath doesn't suddenly wake up one morning and decide to leave. The decision has been forming for months, sometimes years. It's built from repeated experiences that communicate a single message. Your value to me is based on what you can do for me, not who you are. That message is devastating to someone whose entire nature revolves around genuine connection. Because what empaths seek is not perfection. They seek reciprocity. They don't need constant praise. They need acknowledgement. They don't expect people to never make mistakes. They expect people to learn from them. And when those things are absent long enough, a quiet transformation begins. The empath starts protecting their energy. They stop volunteering information. They stop initiating conversations. They stop rushing to solve problems that aren't theirs to solve. They begin investing more of their attention into themselves, their goals, their peace, and the people who genuinely appreciate them. Ironically, this is usually the moment when others finally notice something is wrong. Suddenly, the person who was always available isn't available. The person who always listened has become quiet. The person who always gave advice now responds with a few short words. And confusion follows. People ask what happened. They wonder why the relationship feels different. They search for a specific event to explain the change. But the answer isn't found in a single moment. The answer is found in hundreds of moments that were ignored. Hundreds of opportunities to show appreciation. Hundreds of opportunities to reciprocate effort. Hundreds of opportunities to treat kindness as something valuable rather than something guaranteed. What makes an empath's departure so surprising is that it rarely comes with a warning that others recognize. The warnings were there all along, but they were subtle. A little less enthusiasm. A little more distance. A little less emotional investment. Small signals that something important was changing. Most people don't pay attention to those signals because they assume the empath will always be there. That's the illusion. They confuse patience with permanence. They confuse understanding with unlimited tolerance. They confuse kindness with an inability to walk away. But eventually there comes a moment when the empath realizes a powerful truth. Continuing to give to people who constantly take is not compassion. It's self-neglect. And once that realization becomes clear, everything changes. Not with anger, not with revenge, not with drama, just with silence. The calls become less frequent. The conversations become shorter. The emotional access disappears. And one day, the people who took that kindness for granted discover something they never expected. The person they thought would stay forever has already emotionally left long before they physically disappeared. There is a common belief that empathetic people will tolerate almost anything. Because they are compassionate, patient, and understanding, many assume they have an unlimited capacity to forgive. They imagine that no matter what happens, an empath will always find a reason to stay, another explanation to justify someone's behavior, or another opportunity to give someone the benefit of the doubt. And in the beginning, that often appears to be true. Empaths are naturally inclined to look beneath the surface. When someone lashes out, they don't immediately focus on the behavior. They look for the pain behind it. When someone makes a mistake, they don't instantly judge them. They try to understand what circumstances led to that decision. When someone disappoints them, they often spend more time examining the reasons than dwelling on the disappointment itself. This ability to see beyond actions is one of their greatest strengths, but it can also become one of their greatest vulnerabilities. Because while most people see a lie as a lie, an empath may see fear behind the lie. While others see manipulation, they may see insecurity. While others see selfishness, they may see unresolved wounds. They are often willing to look deeper than everyone else, searching for explanations that help them maintain their belief in the goodness of people. The problem begins when understanding becomes a substitute for accountability. There is a significant difference between understanding why someone hurt you and accepting repeated patterns of hurtful behavior. Yet many people fail to recognize that difference. They assume that because the empath understands them, the empath is unaffected by what they're doing. Nothing could be further from the truth. Empaths feel emotional experiences intensely. They may not always express that pain immediately, but they absorb it. Every broken promise, every misleading statement, every moment of emotional manipulation, every betrayal of trust, it all leaves an imprint. The fascinating part is that most people never see the damage accumulating. Why? Because empaths rarely react the way people expect. When trust is broken, many individuals become confrontational. They demand answers, they express anger, they create immediate consequences. Empaths often do something different. They become observers. They watch, they listen, they pay attention. Instead of focusing on what someone says after a betrayal, they focus on what someone does. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They believe words can repair what behavior continues to destroy. An apology can be meaningful. A promise can sound sincere. An explanation can appear convincing. But empaths are paying attention to something deeper. They are watching for consistency. Anyone can say the right words. Anyone can promise change. Anyone can express regret. The real question is whether behavior follows those words. Because trust is not rebuilt through language. Trust is rebuilt through patterns. And empaths are exceptionally skilled at recognizing patterns. At first, they may overlook inconsistencies. They may tell themselves everyone deserves another chance. They may remind themselves that people make mistakes. They may choose patience over judgment. But each repeated betrayal changes something. Every promise that is broken weakens confidence. Every lie creates uncertainty. Every manipulation creates distance. Every act of dishonesty forces them to question what is real and what is not. What makes emotional betrayal so damaging is that it attacks the foundation of connection itself. Relationships are built on trust. Trust is what allows people to feel safe. Trust is what allows vulnerability. Trust is what allows emotional intimacy. Without trust, relationships become performances. People begin guarding their words. They begin questioning intentions. They begin protecting themselves instead of connecting. And once that process begins, the relationship starts changing in ways that are often invisible from the outside. The empath may still answer messages. They may still attend gatherings. They may still participate in conversations. But internally, they are becoming more cautious, less open, less invested, less willing to expose parts of themselves that can be wounded. This transformation doesn't happen because they want revenge. It happens because the human mind naturally protects itself from repeated harm. Imagine touching a hot surface. The first experience teaches you caution. If it happens repeatedly, your brain becomes increasingly alert to the possibility of being burned again. Emotional experiences operate in much the same way. Repeated betrayal teaches the empath that emotional vulnerability is no longer safe in that environment. And safety matters deeply to people who form strong emotional connections. One of the biggest misunderstandings about empaths is the belief that they leave because they are overly sensitive. In reality, many empaths stay far longer than most people would. They endure situations that others would abandon immediately. They offer chances that others would never give. They forgive behavior that many would consider unforgivable. What eventually drives them away is not a lack of resilience. It's the realization that their resilience is being exploited. There comes a moment when they recognize a painful truth. The problem isn't that mistakes were made. The problem is that the mistakes keep repeating. The problem isn't that trust was broken once. The problem is that trust continues to be broken. The problem isn't the existence of flaws. The problem is the absence of genuine effort to address them. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath understands that someone's words and actions consistently fail to align, they begin seeing the relationship differently. The image they held of that person starts to fade. The explanations become less convincing. The excuses lose their power. The emotional investment begins to shrink, and this process often occurs silently. There are no dramatic announcements, no public declarations, no grand confrontations, just a gradual withdrawal of emotional energy. The empath begins redirecting their focus toward environments where honesty exists, toward people who communicate clearly, toward relationships that feel safe, toward connections that don't require constant emotional repair. What surprises many people is how calm this process can appear. They expect anger. They expect arguments. They expect visible resentment. Instead, they encounter distance. Because by the time the empath reaches the point of leaving, they have often processed much of their grief already. They have spent countless hours thinking, analyzing, questioning, hoping, waiting for change, searching for reasons to stay. By the time they finally detach, much of the emotional struggle has already taken place internally. And that's why their departure can seem sudden to everyone except them. For others, it appears as though they left overnight. For the empath, the decision was built through months or years of repeated experiences. Each betrayal added another piece to the picture. Each disappointment revealed another pattern. Each broken promise confirmed another concern, until eventually the evidence became impossible to ignore. At that point, protecting their peace becomes more important than preserving the relationship. Not because they stopped caring, not because they became cold, not because they lost their ability to forgive, but because they finally understood that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. You can forgive someone and still recognize that they are unsafe. You can wish someone well and still create distance. You can care about someone deeply and still understand that remaining close to them comes at too great a cost. And when an empath reaches that understanding, their behavior changes in a way that often catches people completely off guard. The person who once fought to keep the connection alive stops fighting. The person who once searched for solutions stops searching. The person who once carried the emotional weight of the relationship finally sets it down. And when that happens, the silence that follows is often far more powerful than any argument could ever be. One of the deepest needs every human being has is the desire to feel seen, not looked at, not noticed for convenience, not acknowledged only when useful. Truly seen. Seen for who they are, what they contribute, what they sacrifice, and what they carry when nobody else is paying attention. For highly empathetic people, this need runs even deeper because so much of their energy is spent seeing everyone else. Empaths are often the people who notice the details others overlook. They remember conversations that happened months ago. They remember what someone was worried about, what someone was excited about, and what someone was struggling with. They remember birthdays, important dates, personal goals, and private fears. They pay attention because paying attention is part of who they are. Most people think empathy is simply about being kind. It's much more than that. Empathy is attention. Empathy is awareness. Empathy is the willingness to enter someone else's emotional world and understand it without judgment. Because of this, empaths often become the emotional anchors in relationships. When someone is having a difficult day, they are the first person called. When someone experiences heartbreak, they are the shoulder people lean on. When confusion arises, they become the source of clarity. When conflict appears, they often become the peacemakers. They show up again and again. Not because they are trying to earn love, not because they expect a reward, but because caring comes naturally to them. The problem is that people quickly adapt to receiving what is consistently available. Psychologists have long observed that human beings often stop appreciating things they experience regularly. What once felt special becomes normal. What once felt extraordinary becomes expected. The same thing happens in relationships. The empath's support becomes routine. Their kindness becomes predictable. Their effort becomes invisible. And when something becomes invisible, people stop valuing it the way they once did. This is where a dangerous dynamic begins to develop. The empath continues giving. The people around them continue receiving. But fewer people stop to recognize the effort behind what they are receiving. Fewer people ask how the empath is doing. Fewer people notice when the empath is struggling. Fewer people recognize that the person carrying everyone else's emotional burdens has burdens of their own. Over time, this creates a quiet imbalance. Not an imbalance of affection, an imbalance of awareness. The empath knows everything about everyone, yet very few people truly know the empath. Think about how often this happens. A friend spends an hour talking about their problems while never asking a single meaningful question in return. A partner becomes accustomed to emotional support without offering the same level of emotional presence. Family members assume the empath will always understand, always forgive, and always accommodate. Nobody intentionally plans for this imbalance to occur. It develops gradually. Small moments, repeated over time, moments that communicate a message, not through words, through behavior. The message sounds something like this: I notice what you do for me, but I don't really notice you. For an empath, that message cuts deeper than many people realize. Because empaths don't measure relationships primarily through gifts, status, or appearances. They measure relationships through emotional connection, through mutual understanding, through genuine presence. When those things disappear, the relationship begins losing its meaning. What makes this particularly painful is that empaths often don't ask for much. They aren't usually demanding constant praise. They aren't seeking endless recognition. They aren't expecting applause for every act of kindness. What they want is much simpler. They want reciprocity. They want to feel that the care they extend is also being returned. They want to know that their presence matters beyond what they provide. They want to feel valued as people rather than resources. And when that doesn't happen, something subtle begins to change. At first, they may dismiss their feelings. They may tell themselves they're overthinking. They may convince themselves that everyone is busy. They may continue giving despite feeling overlooked. But feelings that are ignored don't disappear. They accumulate. Every forgotten effort, every unacknowledged sacrifice, every one-sided conversation, every moment of emotional neglect. The weight grows heavier, not because any single event is devastating, but because repeated experiences create patterns, and patterns create beliefs. Eventually, the empath begins forming a belief that is difficult to reverse. The belief that their value in the relationship is conditional. The belief that they are appreciated for what they do rather than who they are. The belief that if they stopped giving, many people would stop noticing them altogether. That realization is one of the most painful discoveries an empath can make, because it forces them to confront a difficult question. If I stopped solving problems, if I stopped providing support, if I stopped carrying the emotional weight, would this relationship still exist in its current form? The answer to that question often determines the future of the connection. What's fascinating is that most people never realize this evaluation is taking place. They continue interacting exactly as they always have. Meanwhile, the empath is quietly paying attention. What observing, measuring, not with resentment, with clarity. They begin noticing who checks in without needing something, who remembers important details about them, who offers support without being asked, who demonstrates appreciation through action rather than occasional words. And once this awareness develops, it becomes impossible to ignore. The relationship starts feeling different, not because the empath suddenly changed, because they finally stopped ignoring what had always been there. This is often the stage where emotional withdrawal begins. The empath becomes less available, less expressive, less emotionally invested, not as punishment, as protection, because emotional energy is valuable, and people eventually stop investing valuable resources into places where they consistently receive little in return. One of the greatest misconceptions about empaths is the idea that they leave because they become angry. In reality, many leave because they become exhausted from carrying relationships, exhausted from being the only one paying attention, exhausted from giving understanding without receiving it, exhausted from feeling emotionally present in relationships where others remain emotionally absent. The dangerous part is that this exhaustion is often invisible. The empath continues smiling, continues helping, continues showing kindness. From the outside, everything appears unchanged. But internally, a decision is slowly forming, not a sudden decision. A gradual one. A realization that their energy could be invested elsewhere. A realization that peace feels better than constant disappointment. A realization that being alone is healthier than feeling alone inside a relationship. And once that realization takes hold, something remarkable happens. The empath stops chasing connection where connection does not naturally exist. They stop forcing conversations. They stop overextending themselves. They stop trying to convince people to value them. Because they understand a fundamental truth. Real appreciation does not need to be demanded. Genuine care does not need to be constantly requested. Meaningful relationships do not require one person to carry all the emotional responsibility. At that point, the withdrawal becomes quiet, almost invisible. No dramatic speeches, no emotional explosions, no attempts to make others feel guilty. Just distance. Steady, deliberate distance. And often, the people around them don't recognize what is happening until it's already happened. They suddenly notice the empath is no longer reaching out, no longer initiating, no longer investing the same energy, and they become confused. Because they assume that person would always be there. They assumed the support was permanent. They assumed the effort would continue forever. What they failed to understand is that even the most compassionate person eventually reaches a limit. Not a limit of kindness, a limit of imbalance, a limit of feeling unseen, a limit of giving without receiving. And when an empath finally reaches that limit, they don't usually leave with anger. They leave with clarity. The clarity that comes from realizing their presence was never fully appreciated, their effort was rarely recognized, and their value was too often measured by what they gave rather than who they were. And when you step back and look at the entire picture, a powerful pattern begins to emerge. Empaths rarely leave because of one argument. They rarely walk away because of one mistake. And they rarely disappear because of one bad day. What pushes them away is the slow accumulation of being taken for granted, emotionally betrayed, and consistently overlooked. It's the realization that their kindness has become expected instead of appreciated. It's the realization that their trust has been treated as something disposable. It's the realization that the effort they pour into others is not being matched by genuine care in return. For a long time, they stay. Longer than most people would. They explain. They forgive. They understand. They give chance after chance, hoping that awareness will create change. But eventually, there comes a moment when something shifts. Not in the relationship. In them. They stop asking whether they are giving enough, and they start asking whether they are receiving enough respect, honesty, and appreciation to justify staying. That question changes everything. Because once an empath understands that their peace is more valuable than constant emotional exhaustion, the decision becomes easier than anyone expects. And here's the part most people never see coming. The final goodbye is rarely spoken. There is no dramatic announcement, no emotional performance, no desperate attempt to make someone understand. The empath simply becomes quieter, more distant, more focused on protecting their energy than explaining their pain. And by the time others realize what is happening, the connection is often already gone. Not because the empath stopped caring, but because they cared for too long without being cared for in return. So if there is one lesson to remember, it is this: never mistake patience for weakness. Never mistake understanding for unlimited tolerance. And never assume that someone who continually gives their heart will continue doing so forever without appreciation. Because the people who care the deepest often leave the quietest. And the most painful loss is not always the person who storms out the door. Sometimes it's the person who slowly stops knocking, slowly stops reaching out, slowly stops believing they matter, and then disappears from your life without a single word. The question is not whether an empath can walk away. The question is whether you'll recognize their value before they do, Because once someone who truly saw the best in you decides they can no longer stay, you may spend a very long time realizing that what disappeared wasn't just a person. It was one of the few people who understood you when nobody else did. And when that kind of connection is gone, it rarely comes back. So before it's too late, ask yourself who in your life keeps showing up for you, who keeps listening when others won't, who keeps understanding when others judge, and most importantly, have you made them feel as valued as they've made you feel? Because sometimes the people who ask for the least appreciation are the ones who deserve it the most. And sometimes the quietest goodbye is the one that echoes forever.